Okay, we're going to spend the next few minutes on the console because what I want to do is I want to demonstrate the different types of data we have, data types specifically. I use the term value and variable. The variable is whatever I'm naming the memory space. The value is what is actually being assigned inside the memory space. However, I could probably more accurately use the word data. Now, the data that I'm going to be storing, my name, versus, say, for instance, a floating point number, 1.3 or 1.0, denotes different types of information, so different types of values. Now, in Python, we use a discrete set of data types that are actually built in. They're predefined data types that we work with. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to walk through an example of each of those from the perspective of my command interpreter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just open Visual Code Studio. And from the perspective of Visual Code Studio, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up to my script, and what I want to do is I'm actually going to grab all of these. So I'm going to grab every one of these values. So these are the variables, are going to be v and some number, and then the data that we're going to have set up in place for it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click and I'm going to say copy, and then all I'm going to do is I'm going to basically come down here, and you can do this from your terminal. I'm just doing it so I don't have to move screens around. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to paste this into my terminal here. I'll try to. Edit. Did I not grab it? Let me try it one more time. So I don't need the operators. So I'll say command copy, come down here and say command paste. There they are. Now, you'll notice that I have 12 total variables defined now. So as an example, Terry is me, my name. So if I type V1, it's going to type the contents of the memory space. Now notice it contains the little single quotations. Now the next one, if I were to type, we see here is going to be 10. So if I say V2, it's going to type the value of 10. Now the single quotation marks corresponds to the fact that the word Terry is a string. Now I'm going to show you a built-in operation called type. So if I come over here and say type V1, the system is going to tell me that this is indeed a string. In fact, it'll recognize V2 as an integer. And if we look at the other values here, we're going to have V3. Well, that's a decimal, and remember I told you that decimals would be called floating points. So it's called a float. Now, when we start looking at things, assigning values can actually be set up in a number of different ways. So look at this value right here. It's Python spelled out, but notice it begins with 3 single quotation marks. Then I type every letter, and then I end it with 3 quotation marks, and this constitutes V4. Now if I type V4, interestingly enough, what we're going to find is the system is going to say, okay, it's P, carriage return, Y, carriage return, T, carriage return, H, carriage return, 0, carriage return, and N will end the field, no carriage return. Let's take a look at that. I'm going to say V4, and what we see here is that we have this value here called N, \N. That is the symbol for Python to insert a carriage return. But notice it didn't insert the carriage return. Now that's because I'm just looking at the contents of the memory space. A carriage return is something that would be implemented if I actually print a value. So if I come over here and say print, and we say V1, notice it just prints Terry, where if I print V1, it actually contains the single quotes which denote this as a string. The system dynamically recognized it as a string value. Again, if I say type V1, recognize it as a string. But what about this thing here where I have these individual letters? Well, watch the difference here. So if I say V4 versus print V4, what we're going to see is the /n's are going to be interpreted as carriage returns. So it gives me a way to be able to not just assign information or data to a memory space, a variable, but it also gives me the capability of being able to dictate some type of formatting. Now, we refer to this mechanism where we use these triple quotes as a docstring method. Now, the question then becomes is, what is this? What is Python? What is the value of v4? Well, if I say type v4, what we'll find is it's still a string. So that's a very interesting way. Now, a lot of times we'll actually create things using the docstring method because it'll actually be a shortcut. But again, keep in mind that it's going to preserve the value. So it's y carriage return. And again, that's going to be denoted by that /n. So it's print a p, and then if it's a print operation, carriage return, and then print a y. Carriage return, print a t. Carriage return, print an h. Carriage return, print an o. Carriage return, print end, and then I'm done. Because there was no carriage return placed at the end of the line where I entered in. I just did the triple quotes. Now, strings are interesting, but they basically contain only one piece of information. So if I come over here and say again, v1, or print v1, I only have one piece of information in here. Well, what about this idea of 5? So I've got v5. Notice v5 is a group of routers, r1, r2, and r3. Now we call a list made like this a list, and it's denoted by these open and closed brackets. So if I come over here now and I type v5, whoops, sorry, Control Z, and down here I type v5, notice it prints those values of r1, r2, r3, and it includes the list value. Now if I come over here and say print v5, there's no change because there was no operation that was passed, and this is a list of values that are basically strings. So if we come over here and I want to see that this is, I can say type, and we'll just come up here and say v5, and that's going to be a list. In fact, later on we'll see that I can actually look at individual values inside of a list. So as an example, let's say I want to look at v5, and let's try index 0. Notice it prints r1. If I type index 1, it prints r2. I can r2. It's going to give me index 3. So the thing here is this is a list of a value set of strings, and each one of these numbers represents an index. Our index numbers will always start at 0, and I have the capability of looking at things discretely. So imagine, we have a list of routers, and I want to look specifically at one of them. Well, that's the value. But keep in mind, these are all still strings. So if I type, and I come over here and say v5, that's going to tell me it's a list. But if I say type v5, and I look at the contents of v5 index 1, or index 0, well, we'll just say index 1. It's a string. Now I can have a list of strings and integers. So as an example, let's make one. I'll say W equals, and I'll do open bracket, and we'll say Terry, comma, and then we'll say is, comma, and we'll say 52. So that's my age. So now if I hit W, I've now got a list. I have a list of strings, and I have a list of integers. Well, a list that contains an integer. So if I wanted to look at one of these, I can say type, we'll say we'll say W, and I'll look at specifically at index 0, which is the very first one. It's a string. 1 is a string, but if I look at 2 is going to be an integer. So keep in mind that I can use lists to actually place multiple values together and have them assigned to a specific memory space. We're going to talk about strings, we're going to talk about lists, we're going to talk about sets, all of these when we cover data types. I just want you guys to have an idea of exactly what our data types are. So the next one is going to be V6. Now from V6, notice it doesn't have brackets, it has parentheses. Now a parenthesis represents a tuple. So let's go ahead and say type V6. So a tuple is going to be a list that can't be changed. So it's an immutable object. I can't modify any value inside of a tuple. Now the object here is here's the thing that bothers me, or the thing that we need to get our mind wrapped around very quickly, and that's going to be the concept of sets and frozen sets. Now to be honest, I very rarely use sets and frozen sets, and I have included them because I am seeing people start to use them more. But again, keep in mind these are all values. So if I come over here and say I want to look at 6 again, let's pick an index. So let's say 0. Close bracket and hit enter. Oops, close bracket. Notice it's a string. So I can look at them individually, but I can't modify them because tuples are not modifiable. Lists are, and we'll talk about how to do that when the time comes. We have a section on tuples also. When it comes to V7, V7, notice it's in curly brackets. Well, that curly brackets actually denote what is referred to as a set. So if I come over here and say V7, and we look at it, notice it's a set. Now sets can be manipulated, but a set is very interesting because a set is only going to include unique variables. So if I come over here and I say W, and we say equals, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a set, so I'm going to use curly brackets. And let's say in here I'm going to say, you know what, we'll use double parentheses, and I'll create a set. We'll say S1. Actually, no, let's do a list first. So if I create a list, I'll say R1, comma, R2, comma, R3. And then close my list. So now W is a list, and it's going to be a list of strings. And notice if I come in here and I say comma R1 again, and we take a look at W, notice it has R1 twice, because a list is going to include everything that I set up. Now what if I do this exact same thing and I build a set? So now what I'm going to do is, instead of using the open and close brackets, I'm just going to use double parentheses. I'm sorry, double parentheses. And if I type W, in the configuration here, we see here that I'm going to have these fields in here. And if I come over and let's see what this is. So I'll say type W. Oh, it came up as a tuple. So tuples and lists all allow me to repeat values. But what about a set? Well, when I created it, I just used the double parentheses. To create a set, I actually have to type the word set in the beginning. So let's go ahead and change this. Now if I type W, what we're going to find is the second R1 is now missing. Now the object to note here is it didn't place them in any kind of order. So it's R3, R2, and R1. But the goal is to understand that if I have a set is going to automatically eliminate any duplicate values. So it's going to be a useful tool to be able to look at data and only look at single entries or single instances of data. And that's why I included it. Now V8 is a frozen set. Now if we take a look at V8, what you're going to see here is in the context of V8, actually I should have, let's take a look at type for V8. It's a frozen set. So in a frozen set is a set that is going to, one, get rid of duplicates, and two, it's frozen. I can't change it. It's an immutable data type, and we'll spend more time with that in a little bit. Now remember, in the previous configuration, I showed you guys I think it was V4, where we created a list using a docstring method. Well, I can also use docstrings again to preserve values. So let's go ahead and say V9. And what we see here is, notice it has the carriage return value in it. If I say type V9, it's a string. So no different than what I illustrated to you guys previously. Now, another thing that we also need to keep in mind is we have a data type called Booleans. Boolean logic, true, false, and, or, and these values actually constitute Boolean logic. So notice there's no quotation, there's no single quotation mark. So it's not a string. So if I come over here and say V10, it's going to print true, and if I do type V10, what it's going to do is it's going to represent it as a Boolean data type. 11 is going to be the same way, and those are the only two. Now, later on we'll get into some other things regarding Boolean logic and what we call the truthiness of a data type. But what I want to do right now is I want to move to the last element, and that's going to be using a docstring to create a list. Now, what's the difference here? So here I use the docstring with the single quote, single quote, single quote, and no other value. So that's basically saying that this is a string. Now, if I come down here and I look at this one, notice I'm using an open bracket. Now, think back to what an open bracket does. An open bracket is going to allow me to be able to create a list. Now, one of the problems with lists is all of the commas and everything. So sometimes we'll take a shortcut and use the docstring method to create a list. So as an example, if I come over here and type V12, it's a list, but you'll notice it has the carriage return values in it. So it's a list in the config because it's got the open and close bracket. So if I say type V12, it's a list. But if I say print V12, it's going to interpret those carriage returns. So let's see, print V12 in the list. What's happening here is it's using these as delimiters. So the carriage returns as delimiters. So it's actually going to print the list. But if I say print, and we say V12, and I want to print index, let's see, 0, 1, so that should be Sheila, my wife. And then we close the parentheses here. Notice it's actually going to print the entire value. So the object here is this is a list, but if I wanted to be able to treat it as a list, I'll actually have to do some manipulation on it. I just wanted to show you guys that you can create lists using docstrings, and we are going to do that in a subsequent lab. Now, what this did basically is just introduce the data types. The key elements that we need to focus on are going to be strings, integers, floating points, tuples, lists, and there was another file type that we are going to call a dictionary. So let's take a look at the dictionary file, and then what we'll do is we will bounce out. So did I not do a dictionary file? No, I left dictionaries off the list. Okay, so we'll actually cover dictionaries in their own section. A dictionary file is basically a list, but it's a list of a value and a variable. So I can create a list that says A equals Terry, and then I can say B equals Bob. And then I can create a list of that, and then what I can do is I can interpret those as key value pairs. Now, that's the key element here, key value pairs. So as an example, I could have R1 and an IP address. I could have R2 and another IP address. I can have R3 and another IP address, and I can put it in a big list. And then what I can do is I can actually part that list. So, but that's called a dictionary file. So the dictionary file doesn't necessarily just indicate the content. It doesn't say what data is stored in a specific location. It actually assigns a variable and the data that's going to be associated with it. So it allows me to put those together. Later on, we'll talk about something called JSON files, JavaScript object notation format. And for the most part, that's going to be a list of dictionaries. So just keep in mind that we have all of these different data types. So I'm trying to figure out why I didn't include it here. I obviously had a reason, so we'll find out why later on, I'm sure. So with this being said, I'm going to wrap up the data types, and what we're going to do is we're going to move to a very, very cohesive conversation about functionality. So ultimately, I want to talk about strings, I want to talk about other elements, but there's still so much more that we need to talk about. We need to talk about math. We need to talk about those Booleans that we described. We need to talk about operations. So again, we're going to continue this line of reasoning in different videos, and then ultimately what we're going to do is we're going to begin looking at setting values and manipulating those values using a number of baked operations or built-in operations. All right, so I'm Terry Vinson, and I'll see you guys in subsequent videos.